Thank you everyone so much for joining. We're really looking forward to a great session today. My name is Andrew Laing. I'm the sales director here at Vistra in the San Francisco Bay Area. I'm excited to moderate the webinar today on employing workers abroad, how to achieve global HR compliance. We're going to dive into a bunch of different topics, but kind of the overarching theme is what companies are looking at when they're expanding into a new country, getting the right setup, looking at common options for establishing local activities, and then we'll dive into some of the HR considerations that we see our clients face. Just want to give everyone a quick introduction. So Saul Howerton, based in Boston, is our head of global people advisory. And then Kelly Leonard is our senior HR business partner for HR advisory based in the UK. They're definitely experts here on the advisory team at Vistra on the HR side. Really looking forward to jumping into their expertise. Great. So like I said, we're going to jump into a number of different issues that our clients face when they're planning and executing their international expansions. Today's session will be about 45 minutes. That's going to include some time for Q&A at the end. So if you have any questions, definitely drop them in the chat box. I'll be keeping an eye on those, and then we'll tee those up at the end. Great. So I think we can start off with the first question here. When expanding into a foreign market, what are some of the key factors to consider when deciding between a legal entity, or there's a lot of other arrangements? Employer of record's really popular these days. Something that a lot of people may not know about is a non-resident employer payroll. So Saul, do you want to kick us off here on what companies should consider when they're expanding?
Yeah, thanks, Andrew. I think recognition that this probably isn't a specific HR question in theory. We kind of talk about some of the factors that we consider. But at the same time, I think it's really important from a grounding standpoint to set the stage. What's going to help guide us through as we consider employing internationally? What are some of the pieces we need to make sure we address as we're looking to bring these employees on in the most compliant manner? So first, one of the biggest areas that we always kind of focus on from a factor standpoint is permanent establishment, also known as PE. It's a tax-related concept, which is going to guide us with all the available options available for employment. Make sure we use the appropriate methodology. A permanent establishment determination oftentimes, or it's a taxable presence determination, oftentimes is going to relate to having a fixed place of business, execution of contracts, working on core business activities in the local country. And this gives the authorities the power to assess corporate income tax, which could result in double taxation, penalties, interest, etc. So it's a really important concept to make sure that we understand. That's going to guide us as we start to look at what types of employment methodologies we'll use going forward. Additionally, when I'm speaking with clients, helping them as they consider new countries for employment, we'll talk a bit about the talent opportunity. A lot of times, the consideration for hiring starts with, we have a really great opportunity to bring on this person, and that could be a really great reason for you to expand internationally. But you do also have to consider, is there an additional market growth around this individual? So are they in a country where we're probably not going to hire anyone else? This is the only thing they're going to do, and they're just going to parachute in and travel quite a bit to other markets. That's actually a different scenario, a different entity we might recommend in that case, versus if you're going to put someone in the country, grow the market from a sales standpoint or a revenue standpoint, it's going to look a little bit different. I would also echo, it's important to understand if you're going to a new country or hiring internationally as a result of a client requirement. For example, do you intend to engage or invoice locally to these customers? Sometimes you might have a big customer that demands that, or they demand, we need to have staff in the country to support this engagement. Those will be pieces that will factor in here as well and help us determine what the best approach to be used in the country is going to be. And lastly, just kind of looking at operational plans. Are you going to be manufacturing, doing R&D in the country versus just a sales officer or just a salesperson even? So those will be pieces that we'll all want to pull together, have some discussions around it, and then they'll help frame up generally the approach to be taken.
Awesome. Yeah, thanks, Saul. So, it seems like there's a lot of things to consider and a lot of options for companies to consider when they're going into a new country. Subsidiaries, branches, a lot of different things thrown out there. Maybe you could go into a little more detail on some of those.
Yeah, sure. So yeah, the natural extension of that consideration, I think, around what your plans are in the country is what options do we now have available? So I mentioned permanent establishment previously. Um, if it's likely or it's determined that you have a permanent establishment, a more substantial footprint is going to be required. And so then we kind of start to look at what options do we have available. And it's going to vary by country. Subsidiary or branches is the next logical approach that you would use if you do have a PE where you're going to have substantive operations in a country. A subsidiary, you probably know, is a separate legal entity. It's going to allow all activities in country, direct employment as well, versus a branch, which is an extension of the parent company, but both will allow core activities, full extension of services locally, and do bring additional compliance requirements. So they're going to be a little heavier in terms of the upfront cost and the upfront effort to put those on the ground to employ locally, but you're going to have more flexibility in terms of approach. Contrast that with a representative office or a payroll registration. So representative offices, a lot of times you'll see those quite a bit in the APAC region, some parts of Europe, versus payroll registration or NRE, you might hear it referred to as. Those are largely in Europe. So these are a bit of a lighter touch approach, but are still a direct employment in a country. So you have less activities generally allowable in the country, but you are still able to employ directly. So slight different model. Again, less of a heavy lift up front, but still gives you some opportunities here for direct employment. And lastly, we have employment of record as the model that as Andrew said, we see a lot of clients taking this on. We would view that great opportunity for you to bring somebody on, very quick to hire, set someone up. Oftentimes you're using, in this case, a third party to employ your workforce. And we would use that as generally a bit of a shorter term view, I would say, as you grow your headcount, grow your activities in the country. Very great solution, but you do need to keep a bit of a watchful eye, I would say, on the legislative landscape. It is somewhat ever changing, and this could bring you, depending on the country, some limited expansion opportunities from a headcount, as well as could limit the amount of time you're actually on that model before you convert to something more substantial.
Awesome. Yeah, Kelly, maybe you wanted to chime in about some of the laws and regulations relating to some of these options.
Yeah, sure, Andrew, thanks. Well, first off, in terms of those kind of employment pieces, it's important to understand the actual role requirement. So, for example, are you looking for a short-term need, where you need a really quick fix, or you're looking for something that's a little bit longer term in its nature? Generally speaking, most hires in the kind of jurisdictions that we'll be thinking of will be either local employees, contractors, or expats. So if we look at each in turn, so for example, let's talk a little bit about local employees and what will be required there. Generally speaking, you'll be having those kind of employment arrangements on a permanent or an indefinite basis. They would typically require local payroll reporting, where you need to produce the remittance of compensation in local currency. It's also important to factor in any statutory obligations in terms of benefits that will need to be in place within that country. I guess the advantage of having the permanent employees established is that they've got their local market knowledge, they bring in stability, and as an employer, you can actually manage their work performance. So there are obviously considerations in terms of managing cross-border relationships and appreciating the difference in customs, ways of working. This may entail managing different schedules to accommodate different time zones. I think we referred to earlier, the fact that I'm in the UK, you're in the US. So clearly there's going to be some different time zones, work schedules that needs to be managed, different holiday periods. So all of these things obviously add a bit of complexity to the mix. In terms of hiring permanent employees, generally there's going to be a significant a significant upfront investment in terms of the costs. And as we say, there will be a longer term arrangement in terms of the liabilities that employment relationship will bring as well. Another option for consideration is where we talk about maybe more of a short-term fix, where it's a particular requirement for a project that needs to be completed. You may wish to utilise contractors for that type of role. Generally speaking, we must obviously ensure that they are bona fide contractors and not deemed employees. We will come on to talk about that a little bit more later. But often there is a need to have a contractor in place where there is a specific requirement for maybe a very specialised task. The individual probably often brings specialist knowledge, and while their compensation costs may be higher, it's generally for a defined period. And importantly, it allows the employer to bring in more flexibility with potentially lesser liabilities if the contractor working relationship is actually, proper in terms of deemed a contractor role. Often we do see contractors in the tech space where there is a demand for critical skills. But as we said, it does bring risks in terms of the misclassification piece. So there are things to consider there, which, as I say, we'll come on to talk about. And then the other element that we can think about as well is obviously expats and the role that they can bring to an organisation in terms of their knowledge. And Saul, I think you had some thoughts around, how we could build that into the recruitment process.
Yeah, thanks, Kelly. I do like to highlight expats as a great solution for staffing in a foreign market. I see them bring a lot of value and upside through this process, though there are additional obligations as an employer that you need to factor into. So there's always a pro and con in a lot of what we do. I think expats bring an ability to export the headquarters culture and some of the vision for the business from a positive standpoint. And also you're able to use that methodology to reward exceptional employees and aid in retention too. So I think those are really important elements to be factored in here. There is, though, a requirement to make sure that you have immigration or work visa requirements in place before an individual might start an assignment or be transferred to a local office. So that's something that's very important to note, because that oftentimes will mean you likely are going to require an entity on the ground, like we talked about subsidiary or branch type approach previously. Normally that is going to be required from a work visa standpoint. And then there are going to be some additional considerations around expat tax planning, weighing the cost of assignments to make sure you get the compensation structure right, and be aware of some additional compliance obligations, whether that be assignment letters, home and host tax filings, maybe shadow payroll, etc. So there are some additional expenses, some additional requirements here, but still, I like to highlight the importance of this option, and still fully supportive of this because of the returns on that investment.
Awesome. Let's dig into contractors a little bit, because I can't tell you how many companies, especially being based here in the Bay Area, I'm talking to a lot of tech companies. Can't tell you how many companies I talk to who are like, oh yeah, we've got 30 contractors in India, and that makes my heart skip a beat a little bit. So yeah, maybe Kelly, you can go into kind of the risks of independent contractors, if there's any kind of consequences or when they might be a good fit.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, like you say, there are risks, and they are generally very high. We are seeing, many countries now clamping down on misclassification in terms of, is it a really, true relationship of a contractor, or is it more deemed to be akin to an employee relationship? So, particularly, we've seen some legislation pushed through, for January 2025 next year in the Netherlands, where they are, specifically enforcing stricter requirements around that area. There are things that you can check, put checks and measures in place to make sure it happens in practice. But that's the thing, you know, you've got to really make sure that it does happen in practice. And for that reason, often we recommend that audits, you know, are undertaken and they're regularly reviewed. Misclassification can generally occur when someone, as we say, is mistakenly categorized by an employer as a contractor rather than an employee. And there is no, you know, there's no one singular test for us to look at to make that determination. But there are some elements that an authority would look to review. And things like that could include, you know, is that individual free to work for other companies, institutions, or are they solely bound to that one company? You know, I would always advise that you're really, really, you know, cautious around the terms of service of agreement to make sure that that employee, well, worker, we should term them worker, isn't actually restricted or contractor to a particular place of work or a particular duty in that sense, so they're not unduly restricted. Other things that we would look to, you know, to consider is, you know, does the individual hold business cards in the name of the company? Do they have company equipment? All of those things can align to potential employee determinations. Other factors are, can the worker be substituted? You know, is that actual individual integrated into the workplace? One of the assessments we could look at is, you know, are they managing a team of people? You know, that could potentially be a risk where they're seen to be deemed part of that continuous workforce. Some of the, you know, the liabilities and the risks that can arise obviously can include non-payment of taxes, social security, pensions, etc., which obviously we need to be very mindful of. And, you know, often we do have clients sort of questioning when often sometimes an employment will actually end as a permanent employee. And they'll ask us the question, well, can we replace them with a contractor status? And often the answer is it's very fraught with difficulties. And you do have to consider, as we've said, all of those points around the misclassification. So I don't know if you've got any like particular examples where you've dealt with that, or you've seen cases arise around misclassification.
Yeah, I have a couple that come to mind when we look at contractors. I have one in particular where a client of mine had a contractor that was in place for several years, and then eventually became an employee, had some tenure with the firm. Eventually, employment relationship doesn't continue on beyond a few years further, and then working through termination proceedings and discussions with the employee, effectively the employee used that period when they were a contractor against the company to try to negotiate for a bit more of a settlement. And in this particular case, they were highlighting some unused holiday that the person did or didn't take. Recognizing that, of course, I was essentially an employee. The authorities look at this. There's been non-compliance from an employer standpoint. You might want to enrich the offer. So these are some horror stories that do happen in reality. So you do need to use caution there. And the other just quick one is I have seen some challenges where sometimes contractors just kind of get in the AP system and they just continue on despite initially being a short-term plan. And so sometimes this can be a bit of a challenge through M&A proceedings where, as Kelly said, an audit is done around the employees and where they are in the world, and a buyer potentially sees a long list of contractors around the globe, which again could likely bring some non-compliant positions, some additional cost to the price of a deal. And so this has caused some challenges that I've seen in the past through an M&A type of discussion. So definitely be aware and make sure that you get some plans in place and you're very specific in terms of when and how you use contractors.
Yeah.
Awesome. Yeah, really, really interesting to hear that it's kind of a, you know, can be a so far so good, but then, you know, that things can come apart years down the line.
Yeah.
So switching gears a little bit here, I know we've talked about a lot of the mechanics of employment, types of employment. When companies are developing their hiring practices, are there any specific like legal or cultural factors? Appreciate this is kind of a global discussion, but is there anything that can kind of guide the creation of those hiring practices in a foreign market?
Sure, yeah. I mean, I think there are, like you say, many factors to consider. I think from a legal perspective, Andrew, I mean, definitely it's important to make sure we've got obviously good employment contracts in place. We've got to make sure that they contain all the essential items for the particular country where the recruitment is happening. There is often going to be a need, obviously, for that to be bilingual. Other elements are sometimes, is the contract alone enough? If the role, for example, is going to be remote working or teleworking, as some countries define it, there will be a requirement to have a remote working agreement. So again, that's something that employers should factor in. In terms of the actual signage of the employment documentation, again, we need to make sure that the factors are, in terms of whether it can be digitally signed, considered. Some countries have very strict requirements regarding qualified electronic signatures. And you might be surprised to hear, but not all countries recognise DocuSign as a certified provider. We do often get, questions around that piece, but some countries are very specific and they do actually require wet signatures, which does obviously bring in more complications to the process. Other elements include making sure that there's a fair processing notice to accompany the employment contract in terms of what under the GDPR. There is a requirement for data controllers to provide certain information to individuals when they hold and process their data. And essentially the employee would need, or candidate in some, in the scenario where it's respective recruitment, would need to give their consent to withhold that data. Other factors to consider as well is, many of our clients, they operate in the EMEA jurisdictions, which will typically have CBAs, collective bargaining agreements in place. And it's really important to understand those collective bargaining agreements in full. They're often, very important in terms of enforcing the minimum terms and conditions, but it's also apparent that they will have an influence on a company's benefits offering as well, because you have to, make sure that you stipulate to those and maintain those minimum T's and C's, essentially. Other things that, to consideration also include, the whole emphasis now on workers' rights. We're seeing so much more in the news now about work-life balance, things like right to request flexible working, the right to disconnect. There's many countries enforcing very strict regulations around record keeping for recording working time. There's also the additional health and safety requirements, protecting employee wellness. We all know since the pandemic, we've seen a much bigger emphasis on mental health, and it's making sure that, employees are undertaking regular risk assessments in that regard, in focusing on not just on the physical health, but on the mental health as well, and making sure that that's factored into stress risk assessments. Lone working considerations may need to be taken on board. So there's an awful lot of factors to consider from a legal perspective. And we're also seeing a lot more now as well in terms of, employees having more protections, which is right, rightly so in terms of discrimination legislation. We're seeing a lot of that legislation being fine-tuned and further protections taking place. Recently in the UK, for example, we've seen more protections around preventing sexual harassment at the workplace. So my advice is always, be really mindful of those local specific responsibilities in country to be able to demonstrate compliance. One area of that as well, obviously, to consider is, employee training and awareness as well is really, critical to making sure that you can actually demonstrate that you're taking all these steps that are actually required under local legislation. Yeah, so in terms of those pieces, I think, they're the kind of the critical elements. From the cultural perspective, I don't know, Saul, have you got, more to kind of add to that?
Yeah, just quickly, Kelly, one legal piece too, we're seeing an increase in, I know you and I talked about this recently, was around pay transparency as well. So that's a piece that legally, we're seeing this evolve globally. Is an area of focus that employers need to be aware of, and ensuring that you have pay transparency associated with employment in a particular country on a global basis. This is something that we're seeing give rise to, and I think this is going to continue to go as and grow as we progress. But I'll switch a little bit to the cultural side, perhaps for just a second, and taking that on. Obviously, we can all kind of agree that we have to put the statutory benefits and obligations in place for all the employees, so we can understand that. But what about some of the supplemental benefits, and focus on benefits specifically that you might offer to your employees, and so, some things that might matter to your employees culturally? And I think um, there are cultural norms that are going to exist and evolve between different locations, and so recognizing that benefits themselves, offerings themselves, convey critical messages to our employees about the commitment we're giving to them as an employer. I think it's very important to benchmark just not just the compensation piece, but also again the benefits piece, to understand what's important. Potentially even survey your employee population to learn a bit more about what matters to them. And again, that's going to be on a regional basis. It will vary, and some markets are going to have some opportunities as well through that process to find some tax advantages, perhaps along the way, on, say, additional pension contributions, or on if you're granting of stock options. There might be some elements there that will make a difference for some employees more regionally. Contrast with other employees in different parts of the world who may actually just simply value variable pay a bit more, or enriched health. Kelly mentioned wellness as well. Those might be more important or more impactful for some employees than others. And so it's just really important to kind of understand what makes a difference, both from a recruitment as well as a retention standpoint. And benefits for me, I think, is a very cultural type of item that you do see vary pretty wildly across different jurisdictions.
Awesome. Yeah. Speaking a little bit more about benefits, I mean, being based here in the US, particularly the Bay Area, a lot of companies are thinking about stock options, different ways of compensating their employees. Some are even trying to keep a consistent benefits program across their global workforce. But what should companies be thinking, or what are some of the strategies for developing those compensation packages that can really attract and retain the talent that they're looking for?
Yeah, well, like you say, Andrew, it's really important at the moment to really focus on that kind of, the acquisition of talent, but also the retention of it as well, in terms of that piece, because it's becoming increasingly difficult now to stand out, as an employer of choice. We're seeing there is quite a gap in terms of the mismatch between jobs available and the skills of the workforce. So, employees now really need to start to think about, employers, sorry, need to start to think about the employee value proposition holistically to attract and retain talent. And I think, a good starting point is to actually assess the local market, and conduct a thorough benchmarking exercise holistically to understand the industry norms. Market changes, as we know, are rapid, and it's important, to understand present position, to be able to do that whole talent acquisition piece and retain your employees throughout, the life cycle. And like, Saul referred to earlier, it's really important to look at, country specific. So, some countries will already have a very comprehensive statutory benefit program in place. And in addition, there may be benefits that, again, we referred to this earlier in terms of tax and social security savings through local legislation. We do see many companies grappling with an aging population and are really looking at ways to incentivize employees and employers, to build into that pension pot. And again, that's another, kind of, consideration as well in terms of that benefits piece. Many employers are now looking at flexible benefits and building a program around that. But a lot of it will depend on, the organisation stance and their, purchasing power. We do have to bear in mind that those organisations with a smaller headcount will have more limited opportunities for some of the wider group benefit plans that we may see. you know, often we have conversations with our clients around the time of renewal in terms of checking, you know, your headcount, costs and things that may change depending on that employee headcount. So it's really important to focus all of those different elements into the benefits package overall. Sorry, Saul, was you?
Yeah, I think I agree with you. I mean, I think all of that has to be factored in to the package available. But you know, there's oftentimes some additional pieces that maybe you don't think about this as being a benefit. So there's some pieces that we oftentimes fall on the side, but are actually really impactful to your employees. One of those being remote working. I think we mentioned it earlier. And this is a real upside in some cases, not just for the employees. They are going to find it as an upside benefit likely to them, saving on commute costs, saving on time spent on a train or in a car. But also some benefit to the company too. It can expand where you can recruit, how you can recruit for those employees. As is, again, with everything we look at, there are some additional pieces you need to just make sure that you're being aware of as an employer around that, whether that be making sure you have a written policy in place, again, hoping to be equitable every time you get this type of question. Make sure your data security, of course, is in place too. That's kind of an obvious one. But then you maybe didn't think about if you're going to offer remote working, you may need to have a written agreement in place. You may need to allow an expense associated with that to make sure the employee is set up properly from a health and safety standpoint in those particular cases. So some food for thought there. And one thing I definitely can assure you as an employer, if you've not gotten this request yet, which I'm doubting, but at some point soon, you will get a knock on the door asking you about, will the company support an international um, remote working scenario? So maybe not quite an expat, as we talked about, but an international assignment for a period requested by an employee. Those are coming. There's a lot of that, obviously, post-pandemic we've seen. And I think it's a great opportunity, again, if you're able to do so, but make sure you're prepared as an employer and understand what you are willing to support as an employer. Are you willing to support a move, let's say, only where you have an entity or a payroll already established? Or would you consider something in a brand new country? Of course, that brings on more compliance, more costs. These are just some considerations you're willing of what you're willing to offer, and some things that are really a nice benefit for the employees if you're able to make this happen for them. But again, you need to factor that in. And the last piece is just around stock options. We kind of mentioned this is still an area we see a lot of upside, a lot of companies offering stock options, great retention tool. Definitely fully supportive of that. But again, just make sure you understand the obligations and when these might be taxable, as well as any potential compliance filings. So you make sure that you're attending to all your local requirements.
Awesome. Yeah, really great information on benefits there. And Saul, I think, and Kelly, you both touched a little bit on policies. So when companies are designing policies, you know, especially with their first global expansion in mind, is there anything they should look out for when designing employee handbooks or policy books, or is it even possible to develop a global policy that covers all the countries that they're operating in? Kelly, do you want to take this one?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I mean, it's always, like say, advisable to have locally compliant handbook. That's obviously, you know, written in accordance with the local employment legislation. It's also important to make sure it's bilingual where needed as well. We do tend to find that, you know, obviously some jurisdictions will have what they call is like their own internal regulations, which generally stipulate the employment policies and employees' working arrangements or rules of working. Generally speaking, you know, there is that option to have a global handbook. And what we would advise, if you do that, you must ensure that you do have local country addendums, because individual, you know, countries will have each requirements specific to that, you know, country's local compliance. So it's important also to ensure that the handbook is regularly reviewed and it's kept up to date, you know, and alive. For example, you know, if it does have commitments in there about training, making sure that those training things are happening as they should be. So all of those things, as I say, yeah, you know, key. Yep.
Awesome. Great. Well, I know we're just as a time check, we're about 8 minutes from the end of the session here. I do want to give a few minutes for Q&A at the end, but really quickly, can you speak to a little bit about restructuring? So I know oftentimes that's a kind of a difficult thing for companies to broach. But yeah, is there anything that they should look at when terminating employees? Oftentimes that's more difficult in other countries than it is here in the U.S. Kelly, are there any points that that companies should think about?
Definitely. I mean, like you say, unfortunately, termination is likely to happen at some part of, the corporate life cycle. There's lots of factors to consider. It's a very complex area. And we'd always, recommend that clients, get cautious, operate with sound advice and, really check to ensure the local understanding of and obligations regarding any processes to be followed. Processes may vary dependent on the number of employees that are impacted, whether employees will be transferring. So, for example, in an M&A scenario, you may have some employees transferring from one company to another, and there are specific requirements in terms of TUPE regulations or the Acquired Rights Directive that employers really need to make sure that they understand what that actually means, because often it will entail the employees' existing terms and conditions are protected, so they'll literally transfer across on the same terms. Same protections may also apply in an EOR transfer situation. I know Saul referred to the employer of record option earlier in terms of the entity piece. So all of those considerations need to be taken place. So in terms of, due diligence, it is really critical that that's done at the outset to ensure that the employers are aware if there are any employee consultation processes that need to happen prior to any change, that's, implemented in the right way. There are also CBAs that may need to be checked as well in terms of transfer. So there's lots and lots of things to really consider, and that's just a whistle stop in terms of the details.
Yeah, Kelly, I might just add one more comment because I know we're short on time. Of course, through that, whether it's a combination of workforce or moving from entity to entity, obviously the importance is making sure that you do have documentation in place, transfer of employment letter, understanding that you may run into some challenges, again, due diligence, when moving employees, trying to keep level of coverage, benefits, like for like. Oftentimes you're going from a potentially larger employment pool to a smaller pool. Might be hard to find some benefits that align exactly. And oftentimes that's going to be not just nice to have, a required item. So I think M&A and restructuring, those kind of pieces always bring out some additional challenges. Leave a little extra time for that, and expect that you're going to have to probably do a bit of an audit, a bit of an analysis to ground exactly what you're going to be able to offer the employees through that process.
Awesome. Well, thank you both so much for sharing all this information. I know that's a lot, and if you do have additional questions, please feel free to drop them in the chat. If you have something that requires a little more conversation, then Saul and Kelly are always happy to take those on. But for right now, let me see here. I just wanted to bring up the Q&A. So we do have a few questions here. There's someone that asked, I have a US-based employee from India who is on an L-1B visa. We're considering moving him to Dubai for a temporary basis, less than 1 year. What should we be considering as options?
Yeah, so I can weigh in a little bit quickly on that one. From a work standpoint, they are going to need immigration requirements in Dubai. So that's something you'll have to certainly take into account. Whether or not depends if you already have activities and an entity in Dubai. I assume the answer is yes. With that, hopefully, but there are some requirements around size of office space that tie directly to your immigration requirements. So you'll want to factor that in as well. Just trying to understand what, from an employment standpoint, you're willing to take on. Cost of living may be variant between the two. Trying to understand and consider that. There again, length of stay in the country. Dubai doesn't have the same challenges around personal income tax for the person, but then that actually also begs the question of what is your approach for the employees? Are you going to provide them with some upside potentially by tax savings, or is that something that the company is looking to benefit from, perhaps as a result of the move? quite a bit to unpack there, but just some quick considerations I think that you want to take on.
Awesome. Thanks, Saul. Another one we have here, as we expand our headcount globally, are there any headcount thresholds we should be aware of to remain compliant?
Yeah. Yes, is the answer to that, Andrew. I mean, often, it does depend on the country, as we say. But generally speaking, there will be, kind of additional compliance burdens as the headcount grows. Each country has its own requirements for compliance reporting, and it is important to look at each country specifically. So, for example, a good example is in the UK, once we reach a headcount of 5 employees, there is a requirement to establish a health and safety policy that's published and written, to all employees. A lot of, thresholds now are kind of entering 50 from many different regulations. So, for example, in Spain, if you have 50 employees, there is a need to publish an equality plan. 50 employees, for example, in Netherlands, there's a whistleblower policy requirement. So there is a lot of different requirements that, once you hit that trigger, that you do need to be cognizant of, because it will mean an extra reporting duty for you as an employer. Definitely.
Awesome.
Yeah,
Really great to know. And then I know we're just about a minute from time, but I did want to sneak this one in since it's a pretty topical, I think. With the growth of AI technology, what potential benefits or risks should be considered with regards to global employment or HR?
I can weigh in on that one, Andrew. Yeah, certainly. You can't turn around without hearing the word AI and how that might be impacting all of our businesses across the globe. On the HR side of things, we're seeing quite a bit in the recruitment, as well as learning and development, annual reviews type of supporting processes. We're seeing quite a bit there. A bit perhaps creeping into updates around employment law, perhaps policies, that kind of thing. So I think there's a multitude of uses for AI in our space. I do think you probably need to just use a bit of caution, is my commentary here. So much of what we do depends on the context, the details behind, like the question on the L1B visa. There's a lot of other questions I would love to ask on that, and the answer might actually vary a little bit depending on the fact pattern that we have. So I think AI is a great opportunity to use and tool to be used as a part of your overarching support model, whether you use your knowledge, your experience, local advice, and AI. I think the combination will hopefully get you to a much better place and make you a very responsive and effective employer.
Awesome. One last one snuck in here while you were answering that, Saul. Is EOR still a valid model compliance-wise? I'll pitch that to both of you.
I'll let Saul take the lead on that one first.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I certainly think so. I think that there is some legislative tightening, I would say, around the globe, depending on the country. You're going to see some challenges again on timelines and potentially whether or not immigration is allowed through that process. We've seen some recent updates there, but I still think it absolutely still has a place. And I think you just need to make sure you understand generally fit for purpose when you're going to be and how quickly you're going to be expanding, I think, is something to be factored in. But yeah, we certainly don't expect anytime soon that it's going to go away.
Yeah, absolutely. I would tack on to that, just do a lot of research when looking to employ in these countries. I think EOR is a very hot button solution right now and easy to do, but as Saul alluded to earlier in the presentation, is it right for what you're looking to achieve in country? So great. Well, I know we're just about a minute over time here, but really want to thank Saul and Kelly for all the information. It's a great session. Thanks to the Vistra marketing team to putting this together. If we didn't get to your questions during the Q&A, we'll reach out to you separately and set up a discussion to dig into those in depth. But thank you so much, everyone, for joining today. I know it's a good chunk of your day, but we really appreciate your time.